There is perhaps nothing that evokes the grim, tortured terror of the Middle Ages more than the institution of the Inquisition, long conceived as the worst imaginable combination of legal impunity and religious fanaticism. The Inquisition remains justly more the object of horror, however, than it is deeply understood. Originating in the 13th century attempt to suppress the dualist form of Christianity known to us now as Catharism, the medieval Inquisition would grow to become one of the most enduring institutions of European Christianity. Indeed, it survives even up to this day as the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. In the first episode of a series, I want to begin to explore the origins and the eventual procedures of the medieval and the later Inquisitions. And if you're interested in magic and hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, I'd hope you'd subscribe to the channel here and check out my other content, including curated playlists on various topics and esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon with a one-time donation by checking out one of our shirts over at our merch, or maybe using the super thanks option below the video. But now, let's turn to the origins of the dread Inquisition of the Middle Ages. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Christianity has, from its earliest origins, placed a deep importance not only on the correct practice of being a Christian, orthopraxy, but also upon the believer holding to a very correct set of doctrinal beliefs, or orthodoxy. To enforce this orthodoxy, the early church made a distinction between people who hold correct theological positions and those that chose to differ or disagree with those positions. And the Greek word for choice, or to choose other than correct dogma, was heresy, and heresy was that term that came to define such heterodox positions over time. Now, I'm going to be using the term heresy throughout this episode, but I always want you to hear it with scare quotes, because, well, I'm not exactly on team Christian orthodoxy, am I? But the traditional manner by which the church dealt with heresy and heretics was to withhold that which was the unique purview and the unique power of the church to provide. Salvation through the administration of the sacraments. You could only get that salvation as mediated by the church. Again, a heretic was still a Christian, just one in need of correction and penance from the official point of view. And if salvation could only be achieved through the mediation of the church via the sacraments, withholding the boon of salvation was indeed a very powerful tool of coercion. And, in fact, this was the only tool the church used for the first millennium of its existence, primarily because heresy was, surprisingly, only a very minor issue through most of the early centuries of the medieval church. Now, that's probably because of a bug and not a feature. The early Middle Ages was marked by an extreme disparity in doctrinal education, even among operating clergy. And it may come as a bit of a shock, but administering the sacraments, the central task of the church, didn't actually require that much in the way of a theological education. And in this period, the great preponderance of educated churchmen were actually pretty isolated from the population out in, remote monasteries, often chosen precisely because of their remoteness from the world. I mean, when the Norse showed up to Iceland, there were already Irish monks living on the island, precisely to isolate themselves in Ultima Thule or wherever. So it probably wasn't that there wasn't heterodox opinions during this period. It was probably that most people, even many priests, didn't really have enough education to know the correct dogmas to then choose to become a heretic. So that's just part of the early Middle Ages. And frankly, before the founding of the Mendicant orders in the 13th century, most common people really never even heard a sermon unless it just so happened that a bishop was traveling through their parish. In short, there probably wasn't heresy because most people didn't know much of what to believe in the first place, much less to know that to believe something and then you believe the other thing, you had to actually know something to choose the heresy. And most people, they just didn't. And further, the medieval church made significant room for both religious ignorance, obviously, and religious doubt. In fact, doubt was considered the normal state for human beings, and the church took it as its job to alleviate such doubt by inspiring faith in common people. Thus, it wasn't uncommon for people to publicly express significant and even foundational doubts about things like the virgin birth, the doctrine of transubstantiation, and the resurrection of the dead at the end of time. These aren't minor theological quibbles, these are foundational doubts about the nature of Christianity. Now, doubt isn't heretical, and it never really was treated as a crime by the medieval church. Heresy, unlike doubt, was a sustained and public express variance of a position at odds with the official doctrines of the church. And doubt is kind of the opposite of that. And even lukewarm church attendance, pretty rare confession, and thus the reception of communion, often open criticism of both the priests and the bishops, who themselves were less than morally upright at this time, was not at all uncommon among regular people in the Middle Ages. So the image of the medieval church as a brutal religious taskmaster just wantonly punishing any religious or social deviance is more true of the later and the early modern period around the Counter-Reformation, and this idea really owes more to sort of anti-Catholic Protestant revisionist history than anything else. The early Middle Ages was pretty relaxed in a lot of ways. Of course, however, heresy did appear from time to time, but prior to the 13th century was treated like any other sin. Serious sin, but just a sin through correction, confession, and repentance. Most charges of heresy were typically academic in nature, such as those levied at Peter Abelard, who is an amazing character in medieval history. And while they were taken seriously, they were never really meant to be thought of as a social problem. I mean, most common people don't know and couldn't care less about the debate between Parisian academics about the nature of universals. Thus, academic heresy was, in most ways at this time period and now, pretty much a self-quarantining problem. But more serious concerns emerge from reform movements within the church. And to understand this, it's important to recall that the medieval church was the largest landowner in Europe, and thus was insanely wealthy. This wealth was not only concentrated around the papal court, but also the local bishops whose vast plantations and ostentatious, even profligate lifestyle stood in direct opposition to, the actual teachings of Jesus and his apostle, like Peter, who said, "I don't have any gold or silver." That wasn't true no more. Further, the church, as we pointed out a moment ago, did a pretty lackluster job in reaching out to minister and educate the vast swaths of common people. Thus emerged reform movements, such as the Dominicans and the Franciscans, which stressed the need for apostolic poverty. Blessed are the poor. That was a thing Jesus said. And, public preaching to common people, like shepherding your flocks, like Jesus said to do. As you can imagine, these reform movements were pretty popular, and they essentially threatened not only the vast wealth of the medieval church, but also the institutional social order of the entire medieval world. Thus, the church had a pretty delicate task in dealing with such reform movements because, taken to their logical extreme, these movements were effectively calling for the dissolution of the institution of the church itself and really uprooting the entire feudal system of control that dominated people's lives at the time. And while the church did have some tolerances for integrating these reform movements, movements which questioned the institutional legitimacy of the church itself were, they were heretical ipso facto. And that's precisely what began to appear in the late 12th century. The dualist Christianity that we now know as Catharism first appeared in Cologne in around 1143 before taking root primarily in France, especially in the Languedoc region down there in the south, and over in northern Italy. Now, I've done several episodes on the Cathars and their theology and worldview, so feel free to take a look at those for deeper dives in their doctrines. But suffice to say, this movement was completely theologically incompatible with Catholic Church orthodoxy. It even provided its own alternative single sacrament, the consolamentum, and it insisted on radical poverty and generally just rejected the legitimacy of the Catholic Church. I mean, it rejected the legitimacy of this entire physical realm. Also, around 1173 in Lyon, the wealthy merchant Waldo embraced a life of radical apostolic poverty. You see a theme here. And while accepting Orthodox doctrine, earned the ire of local authorities through his preaching of said radical poverty. The church maintained that Waldo and his followers didn't have the proper licenses to publicly preach, and when they actually tried to go get those licenses, surprise, surprise, they were refused those licenses, and so the Waldensians developed their own parallel clergy. Well, the establishment of a counter-clergy was taken to be heresy, and by 1215, the entire movement went underground. Well, it actually went into the mountains, so that's not exactly underground, but it survives to this day, Waldensians. Good job. You really beat out the task to destroy you all. It's amazing. And while individual heretics had been condemned to death, these cases in which entire social movements marked by, heresy emerged, and the church was actually completely ill-prepared to deal with them. And again, while individual cases of heresy had been prosecuted, these were highly unregulated affairs. In some cases, the secular state executed heretics actually over and against the wishes of the local clergy conducting the heresy trial, such as was the case of a heretic burned in 1022. In other cases, such as that of a heretic case in 1028, the local bishops adjudicating the case were actually overridden by a mob, and they just lynched the person suspected of heresy. They weren't even convicted yet. And similar, numerous extrajudicial killings also took place against suspected Cathars, and this often resulted in mass mob violence, something that the church was horrified by. Again, simply put, the church simply had no regulatory mechanism to deal with heresy at the individual level, much less as mass social movements were developing. And this is partially due to an inherent difficulty faced by the vocation of the church itself. Whereas secular law existed to, punish those who broke the law, the vocation of the church was to aid sinners towards salvation through correction and penance, and not punishment. I know that's surprising in an episode about the Inquisition, but that's the stated vocation of the church. It simply had no right to punish people. That was in the hands of God's judgment and secular law. Indeed, the church had a vested interest, a stated interest in not having sinners killed, precisely because its task was to secure salvation for them, and you can't exactly do that for people when they're dead. So, however, that didn't stop the secular arm of the law from punishing heresy, and almost everywhere had anti-heresy laws on secular books. And this attitude would generally shift as individual cases of heresy gave way to mass popular social movements, which threatened the very legitimacy and the existence of the church itself. The church began to become much more interested in getting rid of heretics in a mass way. Finally, the church realized that to forestall extrajudicial killings of suspected or convicted heretics, there needed to be an orderly institutional body and process by which suspected heretics could be internally processed by the church before being turned over to the secular authorities. In effect, a bureaucratic solution was required to deal with heresy. Bureaucracy was the answer. Yeah, it just got that Kafkaesque. But what would that process look like? Well, aside from barring heretics from the sacraments and kind of ad hoc clerical investigations, there was virtually no consensus as to what else could be done by the church. They weren't all powerful the way you might think they were. And especially dealing with the Cathars, who had an alternative sacrament anyhow, they didn't want the Catholic sacrament. The exact processing of suspected heretics was completely unsettled. Now, the rise of canon law and the revival of Roman law over and against the old system of ordeals like swimming witches, which was outlawed in 1215 by the Catholic Church. That was an important shift, and thus Gratian's decretals held that a legitimate authority could deprive convicted heretics of their land and titles, and even their life, if that were for the common good. Keep that part in mind. You could kill them if it were for the common good. With social heresy on the rise, Pope Lucius III, who sounds like a Rocky character, ordered that bishops should seek out heresy in their parishes and deprive locals of their fiefs in the hopes of eliminating it. Though this bull ad abolendum was hardly practiced because local bishops didn't have really a staff to go seeking out heresy to perform this task, and frankly, they didn't really want to interfere with local lords who were more like their peers than anything else. Remember, the bishops are just sort of like church aristocracy. In 1199, Pope Innocent III, whose name is fantastic, clarified all of this and ordered that lands held by heretics to be surrendered to secular authorities, with all titles subsequently forfeited, even for legitimate Catholic heirs of those heretics. So this kind of got people's families involved in de-hereticating them. Though to be clear, there's no mention in any of these texts for capital punishment for heresy, and the official position of the church was actually to have mercy even if they turn them over to the secular arm to be burned, because again, you can't save, burn heretics. And with all this, nothing changed. Suspected Cathars were still being burned alive with little or no trial outside of France and in the north, and within France, where the Cathars were locals, the locals there were more or less happy to let the Cathars be. In fact, many of the local lords resented outside interference and were probably often highly sympathetic to the Cathars, who were admired precisely because of their piety and devotion to the common people. You know, they did Jesus-like stuff. Not to be stopped, Pope Innocent sent in members of the Cistercian order to begin to preach orthodoxy, and in the region, and this was all kind of going okay when in 1208 a papal legate was assassinated and all hell broke loose with the 1209 Albigensian Crusade. This war, an ongoing series of massacres against the civilian population, would go on for 20 years and was marked by unimaginable bloodshed and massacre upon slaughter, before rapidly just devolving into a naked land grab by northern French nobles. Certainly more heretics were massacred in the first few years of the war than in the past several centuries combined. And this wanton killing, it wasn't really the aim of the church. Again, I know I'm coming across as pro-church here, but I really believe them when they say they just don't want mass killings like this, despite often a cynical take on history. Of course, the church wanted to uproot heresy, but it ultimately wanted the heretics returned to orthodoxy. That was the vocation of the church, not massacred without as much as a trial. And if a body existed for dealing with heresy at the root of the heresy, if it had existed, then the situation in France would have never gotten to this point, as pointed out by the first generation of the Inquisitors in the region, like Bernard Coe and Bernard Guy. If they'd had Inquisition before, they'd have never had the Albigensian Crusade. Thus, one of the chief goals of the 1215 Lateran Council was to establish just such a procedure and just such a body to administer it. Further, it wasn't enough to just wait around for heresy to emerge and then deal with it. It was going to be the task of the church to actively seek it out, and thus this body of joint inquiry, and prosecution began to come into existence. It began to flicker into existence. Sorry, the flicker joke. This is the birth of the Inquisition. Well, kinda it flickered into existence. There's debate about when the Inquisition comes into existence, but let's call it 1215 for funsies. What had previously been a completely haphazard collection of church jurisprudence was now becoming standardized. Confession and communion were made mandatory at least once a year, which by the way tells you that many people didn't even get it once a year prior to this. Convicted heretics who didn't repent were to be excommunicated and then turned over to the secular arm to be burned. So that was settled. Their lands were to be forfeited and any titles stripped from the hereticated families. Those suspected of heresy had to prove their innocence by what is called compurgation. This is where Orthodox Christians would swear legal oaths attesting to the orthodoxy of the person accused of heresy. and failure to do so within a year automatically resulted in conviction and excommunication and being burned. Leaders who sheltered heretics would be treated as heretics themselves. Bishops must now actively seek out and deracinate heresy in their parishes, and secular governments are all expected to begin to bring their own legal policies in line with the new policies developed in the 1215 Lateran Council on this whole business of heresy. The only real leader to refuse, actually, was Alfonso X, Alfonso the Wise, rightly named, whose kingdom had actually struck a really cool balance between the various religions, between Christians and Jews and Muslims, and I think outside interference would have just derailed all that, and he was pretty wise. It's of course ironic considering that Spain alone was free of the early years of the Inquisition, considering the role that it would eventually come to play there some centuries later. While Inquisition was the order of the day, the exact methods for carrying it out varied still significantly from location to location, with sometimes the initiative falling on local bishops in some areas. In other areas, secular leaders would pick up the task. Sometimes combination of secular leaders and priests as a kind of weird grand jury system, but frankly, none of these still proved effective. Bishops were more aristocrats than bureaucrats. Secular leaders lacked the theological training used to effectively analyze and diagnose heresy, and joint grand jury-like systems with secular and religious figures often were just at odds with one another because the secular folks wanted to punish a crime and the religious folks wanted to return them to orthodoxy. That's going to be a problem later. What was needed was a uniform body of people dedicated to stamping out heresy and preaching theological orthodoxy, and the church found them in the newly found mendicant orders, especially the Dominicans, and to a lesser degree in the Franciscans, really a couple generations after the beginning of the Franciscans. In fact, the Dominicans had been founded, at least in part, as the Orthodox Church's answer to the Cathars' insistence on apostolic poverty and preaching to common people. They're kind of like the kryptonite to the Cathars. Furthermore, they had the requisite theological training and answered directly to the Pope, and they were diffused through all the various secular lands. Finally, given their commitment to poverty, they would be immune to bribery, or so the thinking went. We'll say the early generations of the Inquisition were pretty outstanding in that regard. Thus, by the reign of Pope Gregory IX, the Inquisition had just become a fact of life in Christian Europe, and it never went away. So, how did the Inquisition function in these early years? Well, within about 10 years, the basic procedures had become largely standardized. The role of the Inquisition was simple: to inquire into heresy, to establish guilt, to persuade the offender to recant, passing a sentence of penances if they were found guilty, and then passing the guilty to the secular arm if the heretic were recalcitrant. Notice how this is similar but quite different than a secular court who only established guilt or innocence and it merited out any kind of accompanying punishments. The Inquisition had a very strange job in that it had no ability to compel people to its tribunals or even institute punishments, only voluntary penances, as we'll see, and it mostly had to deal with people's inward beliefs, their inward ideas and feelings, rather than outward crimes like killing people. And it had the obligation to bring the heretic back into the fold of orthodoxy through confession and repentance. The state doesn't give a damn if you feel sad because you robbed someone. Who cares? Thus, Inquisition had no legal training to speak of, and while they operated in parallel to secular legal authorities, they often went about their tasks very, very differently. So, how did this work in practice? Well, an inquisitor, along with a small staff, would visit an area reputed to be, inflicted with heresy. Upon arrival, they'd gather the local population for a public sermon, which was voluntary. You didn't have to attend, but you didn't want to be the guy that didn't attend. And again, this was kind of extraordinary. Many people rarely ever heard sermons. Following the sermon, which were, again, pretty rare back then, the inquisitor would announce that they would be at work seeking out heresy in the region, and that a grace period, usually about a week from Sunday to Sunday, had begun, such that anyone could come to the inquisitor and confess any heresy that they held to, and there'd be little more to pay than canonical penances. In some cases, the population actually just refused to cooperate, And we know this happened, and in those cases, sometimes the Inquisitor just packed up and went elsewhere. They couldn't compel anyone to do anything. If, however, he suspected that widespread refusal was actually concealing heresy, he might choose to actually just depose the entire area. And this was rare, but sometimes entire populations of thousands, tens of thousands, could be deposed by the Inquisition if they are seeking out particular heresy. Usually, however, people would take advantage of this grace period. They would confess for themselves whatever heresy they believed in, and of course, they would name names as part of the completion of the confession, because heresy rarely ever happens in ones. If two witnesses name the same person, that person would then be summoned to appear before the Inquisition. If they failed to do so, guilt would be assumed, and this would almost certainly lead to arrest by the secular authorities, and of course capital punishment was likely to follow. Again, everything was voluntary when it came to the Inquisition. Once before the Inquisitional Tribunal, on the account of, again, those two witnesses, guilt was assumed, and it was a task of the suspected heretic to prove their innocence. This is not going to go well. The trial itself was carried out in camera or in secret, and only the Inquisitors and their staff were allowed in. Again, there were no bailiffs here, and the accused could just walk out at any point, though, again, often right into the hands of the secular authorities. So there are cases where people literally walked out of an Inquisitional tribunal and went into the mountains and were never seen again. The accused wasn't allowed to know the identity of the people that accused them. That was there to prevent the outbreak of vendettas, which that happened early on. Though if the accused could show that those who were accusing them did so out of some kind of enmity and not an actual real confession of heresy, this would automatically lead to an acquittal. And of course, you don't want to be the people lying to the Inquisition because, yeah, that's a bad situation. Further, the accused didn't have the right to call witnesses, and technically they could have a lawyer, but no lawyer was ever going to work with a heretic. I mean, again, they're assumed to be guilty, and defending heresy means that you're literally defending not just a person accused, but you're defending heresy. So you don't want to be that lawyer. And conviction of the heretic also meant conviction of the lawyer, thus they were very rarely ever retained. Now, if the Inquisition very strongly suspected that the accused had not completed a full confession and a full recantation, they had access to torture, because it's the Inquisition, though they were only allowed a very narrow selection of torture techniques. And in fact, torture had actually only become authorized about 30 years into the Inquisition's history. In fact, if you want a birth date for the Inquisitional torture, it's Wednesday, May 15th, 1252, in a papal bull called Extirpanda, following the assassination of the Inquisitor Peter of Verona by Cathar agents, because this needs to be a movie. The most common form of torture, as you may know, was strappado torture, where the victim would have their hands bound behind their back and they would be lifted into the air by their wrists. Weights could be attached to their feet, and the rope holding them in the air could be struck with a bar to further agonize the victims, though such torture could only be carried out once. You can only be tortured once by the Inquisition, and if a confession were actually achieved through torture, it had to be affirmed the following day without torture to be binding. Even early on, there was a kind of ambivalence about the propriety of torture. It's not that it didn't work, it's that even back then, they knew that it always worked. Now, acquittals were uncommon, but they did occur most often as a result of compurgation, again, or Orthodox people testifying under oath to the accused on orthodoxy, or by appeals to higher level inquisitors, or you could appeal to the Pope himself. Again, the Dominicans answered directly to the Pope, and often inquisitors were Dominicans. Though there were even some cases where local bishops would actually personally intervene if the local inquisitor was deemed to be overly zealous or deemed, crazy, mentally unfit for the role. That, in fact, even happened to the author of the infamous witch-hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum. Local bishop kicked out Inquisitor because he was positively obsessed with the sexuality of a local woman, and the bishop thought he was nuts, and he was. However, if you were convicted, the sentence was excommunication, and thus one was hellbound. Further, heresy was, of course, a secular crime in virtually every secular jurisdiction, and conviction by the Inquisition almost certainly meant execution by the secular arm, typically by being burned alive. Though, unlike the Inquisition, bribery was rampant in the secular arm, and it was pretty common to secure the mercy of strangulation before burning when possible. You had to bribe your way to being strangled before your body was burned. The Middle Ages is just a nightmare. However, if one confessed guilt and fully cooperated with the Inquisition, it was very likely, actually, that you would only receive what are referred to as canonical penances, the nature of which could range significantly. In medieval theology, it's worth remembering that sin was sought to separate the soul from God. And while confession allowed the sacrifice of Christ to heal that separation, again, the word salvation comes from the Latin word to mean heal, to heal, this outrage against God still required justice. Canonical penances were the price one paid to settle the justice debt owed to God, but they had to be performed voluntarily. You couldn't be commanded to do penances. Hence, they were not punishments imposed from the outside, but they are meant to be acts of devotion done out of one's own spiritual volition. And typically these took the form of additional prayers, fasting on certain days, or attending additional church services. But they could also include things like pilgrimages, sometimes which were very dangerous, being publicly flogged, having one's head shaved, being sent on crusade. That one was a death sentence. Or the most famous penance of the Inquisition, the one that they really pioneered, was being forced to wear the yellow cross on one's clothing. Being forced to wear yellow things on one's clothing. That one could also be sent to prison, and indeed the Inquisition is the first institution to use imprisonment on a wide scale in Europe. Prisons in the Inquisition came in two flavors. They were monastery-like, the Murus Largus, which was similar to a monk's cell in that it had windows and the prisoner wasn't chained to the wall. They were also allowed to mingle with other prisoners, and they could have visitation from close family members. The Murus Strictus was, well, worse. This was a dungeon. There were no visitations, and you were chained often to the wall. The diet in both these prisons was Spartan and simple. It was bread and water, and sentences came in one duration: life imprisonment. Though any penance, including imprisonment, could and was often commuted. Very few people spent all their life in prison, only really high-level heretics. In this way, penance was basically to become a monk in the first case and a anchorite in the second. If one failed to perform the penances, this was a sign of heretical relapse, and a second trial could be potentially commenced, or one was just, excommunicated and handed over to the secular arm. But again, these are penances, not punishments. You could just walk out of some of these inquisitional prisons, and there were cases where Cathars just left, gave someone the consolamentum, and then fled and never was found again. Although if you were caught, that was bad, real bad. As we've mentioned, the relationship of the Inquisition to the secular arm was really complicated on a number of fronts. The main tension here was around precisely the issue of capital punishment for those convicted of heresy. Again, the ultimate goal of the Inquisition was not only to eradicate heresy, but also to save the souls of the heretics through repentance, and that was, again, impossible to do once the secular arm, burned them alive, or strangled them first and then burned them because they were merciful. But this was a complicated situation. The Inquisition wanted to put on a show of force against heresy to prevent it from ever getting a foothold like it had with the Cathars, and, well, burning people makes quite an impression. And if you're a would-be heretic and you see a would-be heretic get burned alive, it might be a deterrent. But when genuine repentance had or could occur, the church was often less than eager to relax people over to the secular arm because of the whole burning thing. Why? Because this actively discouraged people from confessing heresy to the Inquisition in the first place. If you knew that confession is going to get you burned, why do it? Just run. But from the point of view of the secular arm, if someone had committed a crime, them feeling sorry for it, it's fine, but they still got to get punished. Otherwise, what's the point of laws in the first place? To assuage this weird tension and meet the secular arm halfway, so to speak, the Inquisition decided to announce guilt and the penances publicly. They began to look a lot more like punishments because that's what they were. Though in some cases the secular arm actually had no interest in burning people simply because they'd run afoul of a particular inquisitor, especially a particularly crazy inquisitor, especially on some minor point of theology that the state had no interest in dealing with. So the relationship between the two, the secular arm and the Inquisition, was complicated to say the very least. And all of this is nothing if not a cautionary tale about the church and the state operating together. Oh, and did I mention that dead people could also be put on trial by the Inquisition? Of course, dead people can't confess to things, but they can be found guilty. They can be deprived of a Christian reburial, and their bones can be publicly burned, and their heirs deprived of title and land. Yeah, it just got that macabre. And macabre and Kafkaesque now, like burning the bones of dead heretics in public. So, how murderous was the medieval Inquisition? Well, if you look at the Inquisitional records for the period following the Albigensian Crusade, which was super murderous, when the Inquisition was the most fierce in the region, there in Languedoc, Bernard of Caus sentenced 207 people between May 12th and July 22nd, 1246. None of the 207 went to the stake, 23 were imprisoned, and the other 184 had to wear the yellow cross as penance. That's it. From 1249 to 57 in the Inquisition of Southern France, the heartland of the Cathars, there were 230 people sentenced to imprisonment, and 21 went over to the secular arm to be burned. That comes out to about 3 people being burned for heresy a year in the Cathar heartland at the height of the Inquisition, where about 90% of people, it seems, received canonical penances. Now, I'm not justifying it, but that's what it was. The most powerful inquisitor of this early period and the writer of the first sustained inquisitorial manual, Bernard Guy, convicted 636 individuals of 940 counts of heresy. Though recent research has actually shown that only 45 individuals convicted by Guy, this is about 7% of the total convicted, were executed. 7% execution rate, while 307 were imprisoned and 143 were sent to wear crosses, and 9 of them were sent on compulsory pilgrimages. Again, pilgrimages. This is far less than those killed extrajudicially prior to the Crusade, and obviously much, much fewer than the bloodletting that was the Crusade itself. So, was all this successful in stamping out heresy? It's hard to say. I mean, obviously a great many people were simply massacred during the Albigensian Crusade, so maybe that just got rid of a bunch of them. And the Cathar leadership didn't have children, and the perfecti were slow to pass on the rank of perfecti. And frankly, many fled to northern Italy in the mountains, really when the Inquisition was just first coming online. Though the last known Cathar was executed in 1321, and by then the Waldensians had kind of reached a bit of detente with the church. In short, we'll probably never know the exact impact of the Inquisition at this early period. Though, with the eradication of the Cathars, the Inquisition, now established through all of Europe, with the exception of the territory of Alfonso the Wise, good job, Alfonso the Wise, it began to shift gears from actively repressing an entrenched, largely regional heresy, Catharism, to actively seeking out heresy before it could spread at all. And as the beta testing years of the Inquisition in the 13th century became the 14th century, such novel heresies, and just made-up heresies, were combated, from the eradication of the Knights Templar and a complete kangaroo court, the execution of Joan of Arc, alleged Luciferians, and a flare-up of anti-Waldensian persecution over there in Germany, the spiritual anarchism of the movement of the Free Spirit, the erotic mysticism of the Beguines and the Bechards, the spiritual Franciscans, and the extremely strange cult of Guilima. This period would also mark the transition of sorcery and witchcraft from just, good old-fashioned sins to heresy, thus involving the Inquisition and setting the stage for the early modern witch hunts. So the next episode is going to cover the Inquisition as it operated in the 14th century, before its decline as an institution, before its eventual revival in the infamously horrible Spanish and Roman versions, which, yes, they were nightmarish. But until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.